And so joining us now with more on all the latest developments in the region and beyond are Brigadier General Relik Shafir, former Air Force Base Commander, and Professor Gerald Steinberg from NGO Monitor. Thank you both for joining us today. So, Relik, let's start with you. We'll start with Lebanon and the Iranian terror proxy Hezbollah. They breached the ceasefire, and Israel has, of course, responded. So what is likely to happen now on this front? Are we heading towards an escalation?
I don't think so. If you take one drone that hit Israeli soldiers, and then the whole blow up of the entire ridge, and in fact blowing up everything underneath, including the Hezbollah people down there, Israel was looking for a reason to attack those and finish the mission it had started before, and use this as, I wouldn't say it's a pretext, but as a reason for going ahead. And this was something that it seems to be agreeable with the U.S. and the Lebanese government to shut off this incursion in that area, which Israel cannot allow itself to have Hezbollah hold that area. So I think it's a minor infringement that was used, and by the way, rightly so. I think it'll stay quiet, relatively quiet, as we go on and as the deliberations with the Lebanese government and the power struggle they have with Hezbollah, as we hope it tips towards the government.
And Gerald, turning to you, we saw the Prime Minister's office release a very unusual statement about the incident on a Saturday. And, we've seen Israel and Lebanon engaging in peace talks for some time now with some progress being reported. And we also know, of course, that Hezbollah is seeking to undermine these talks. Can you maybe comment on the status of the talks right now and if Hezbollah is succeeding with this latest escalation?
It's important to look at the entire Lebanese front, first of all, in the bigger picture, which involves Iran and all of what Trump's been threatening in the Iranian response, and also, to some degree, also Gaza. We ought to keep that into account, too. In Lebanon, the United States is a major player now. The ceasefire that was announced was under pressure from Washington, from the Trump administration. Israel accepted it, I would say, reluctantly somewhat. But preparing targets, which we saw yesterday, and that goes back to what Relik said, the target bank exists, and Hezbollah needs to remember that, to see it, that any moves that they make, use of drones, any attacks, any injuries, any deaths caused to Israeli soldiers, is going to be met by massive force, and it's going to cost them dearly, as in this case. Whether that message has been transmitted strongly enough to keep the number of incidents and the scale of the incidents down, or whether Hezbollah will seek to escalate and test Israel's resolve, remains uncertain. We have to see what happens. The Prime Minister's statement was a message both to Hezbollah, but also to the United States, to Washington, saying, look, we know that you want to have a ceasefire. We know that you're sponsoring these negotiations, but the Lebanese government is not going to be able to disarm Hezbollah. That's a fiction. And we've seen that. And the attack that took place, was it, I guess, Friday or Saturday morning against the Israeli soldiers, was an example of Hezbollah maintaining some capabilities, and it's up to Israel to prevent them from being able to exercise those attacks, to use those capabilities. So we're going to continue to have this back and forth. I'm a little less optimistic than Relik is on this. I hope that he's right, but I think the Hezbollah will continue to test and probe and will use some weapons periodically, to try to injure and perhaps kill some Israeli soldiers. Israel has to maintain the capability of responding massively. And at least what we've seen so far is that the United States understands that. The negotiations with the Lebanese government are, I won't say entirely theater, but they're talking about disarming Hezbollah, pilot zones. They're going to prevent Hezbollah from re-entering. The Lebanese army just doesn't have that capability, and they're unlikely to have it. And that's something that needs to be, I think, stated more honestly.
Mm-hmm. And you made some very interesting points that I want to circle back to. But first, Relik, I want to go back to you. And, we've heard a lot about the Ali Tahel Ridge in the past few weeks. Can you maybe discuss the significance of this ridge to Israel and to Lebanon?
This was the major weapons cache and underground command and control center, and housing a lot of Hezbollah warriors that were ready to launch towards Israel. It's further back than the front line, as strategically it should be. And I would say that it's probably the last holding point for Hezbollah. And once this is gone, they will not have a major place in the area south of the Litani or in the Litani area to launch the attacks, to hide the weapon caches, etc., etc. So this is of strategic importance, but I wouldn't say that after taking it out, it will diminish that much the Hezbollah capabilities that are housed further back north, mainly in the Bekaa Valley. And in order to take those out, this would need a whole-out war by Israel. We've tried that in 1982, and I don't think we want to go back there. So a lot of pressure on Iran, and the Hezbollah will not stop firing prior to an agreement with Iran, because this is one of Iran's strongest, or it is Iran's strongest proxy, and as long as it's active, Iran has some leverage other than what it has in the Gulf, and so there are no expectations that this will be solved sooner than the Iran crisis, but it can be diminished, and with a lot of pressure on the Lebanese army, maybe they can show some ability to take control of some points, and this remains to be seen. I'm a little more optimistic than the professor.
So, Gerald, back to you. You said that when looking at the situation in Lebanon, we really have to see sort of the big picture. Now, we see that there are those in Lebanon who do want to be free of Iranian influence, but the Islamic regime, through its terror proxy Hezbollah, is so deeply embedded in Lebanon, as well as in the Lebanese army, as you mentioned. So, what can Israel and the United States essentially do to ensure, that these diplomatic talks do succeed, or that essentially Hezbollah is disarmed, or some kind of solution is reached?
Well, I think Relik pointed to the hope, perhaps the strategy, which is to strengthen the Lebanese army's capabilities, give them a little more, both the capabilities, but also the purpose. Sense of purpose, that this is important for the survival or the recreation, really, of a Lebanese state. Lebanon basically stopped to exist as an independent state when Hezbollah became very strong. And I'd say whether that's 30 years ago, 35 years ago, sometime in that period, Lebanon basically became just an empty shell for the Iranian proxy army of Hezbollah. I know that's an exaggeration. And there are certainly forces within Lebanon who want to see that end, but they're not going to give up their lives in large numbers to do that. So then we look at Iran as being the major player here. A weakened Iran will by definition lead to a weakened Hezbollah. They won't be able to reinforce or rebuild their military capabilities, what they've lost, not just in the Al-Tahrir Ridge, but elsewhere in terms of weapons capabilities. They still maintain a lot, as Relik said, in the Bekaa Valley. But if they can't bring a lot of that further south, it'll be difficult for them to threaten Israel seriously. If Iran becomes weaker and weaker, and that's the Trump strategy, I'm ignoring all of the, or at least I'm not paying much attention to the rhetoric. We hear lots of rhetoric from Trump. We hear lots of rhetoric from the Iranians. That's all theater. It's about capabilities. If the Iranian regime is weakened economically, which is the most likely strategy we're seeing now, by the inability to export oil, If Trump is serious about maintaining that blockade on Iran, that will hurt the Iranian regime far more than it will hurt the Americans and the increase in gas prices that Trump and J.D. Vance are concerned about. If Iran becomes weaker economically, politically, internally, socially, and in other ways, then Hezbollah will become much weaker as well. That's really the key. We got to keep the pressure on Hezbollah, not allow them to reestablish their capabilities near the Israeli border, south of Litani, north of Litani. But at the same time, the real pressure point has to be on Iran, the regime in Tehran.
Mm-hmm. And Gerald, I do want to get back to the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Trump strategy in just a minute. But Relik, I do want to ask you, because at the end of the day, we see, we know, we constantly hear that Hezbollah in Lebanon, and not just, also Hamas in Gaza, they're regrouping, they're rearming, and Israel at the moment, whether it's due to U.S. pressure or other considerations, is doing very little to respond. I mean, we saw this strike in response to the drone attack, but other than that, Israel has been doing very little in terms of responding, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. So how sustainable is this strategy for Israel?
It's not really sustainable, and it's not only in Gaza and Lebanon, it's also in the West Bank, that Israel does not have the freedom to act as the government thinks it should. This is also a point of dispute among Israelis, what is the right course to take. But certainly until the elections, the right-wing government will not change its course in any manner because of their strategy towards the elections. After the elections, who knows? But Israel did not pursue any diplomatic or strategic goals, attainable goals, within the world to get support for the ends that it sees. And then one of the points is that this particular government does not have an end in sight or a strategy on where it wants to go. What are the borders that we want? What to do with the Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and certainly with Lebanon. Who can strengthen Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm afraid we're in limbo until the end of October, certainly 3rd of November, as the midterm elections are coming up, right after the Israeli elections. So I think we're going to see more of the same, stalemate, or whichever you want to call it, until the elections and until Israel and the United States can pursue a strategy that is tangible and convince the public that that is attainable. That remains to be seen.
So, Relik, you used the phrase that I constantly use, they're in limbo, and that's sort of the situation we're in right now in Israel on all fronts, at least that's what it seems. So, Gerald, turning back to you and back to the Islamic Republic, you said that you're not paying attention to the rhetoric, but right now it seems that that's where we are, sort of a battle of words between President Trump and Iranian officials over the Strait of Hormuz. And as Relik said, we're in limbo. There's no negotiations happening, no military action happening. So what now? I mean, you said that the Trump administration is switching to sort of an economic pressure campaign. Is that enough?
It's hard to tell whether it's going to be enough, but that is what we're seeing now. That's probably the least bad option for most of the actors involved. It's a war of attrition. In Lebanon, there's a war of attrition. It's relatively low-key, but it could very much escalate. And then the limbo becomes a real problem. It is already, but that'll become a much greater problem. Gaza also, that Hamas is trying to move to a war of attrition. I want to say a word just quickly about, before I get to the Strait of Hormuz and Iran, unless you want to do Gaza later. I don't know how much time we have left. But the fact that we now have a very high-level visit, the friction over what's called the Board of Peace in Trump's plan in Gaza, that's where Washington's putting its emphasis. Not in Lebanon, not so much in Iran, but vis-a-vis Israel, and the actions in Gaza. The American government, the administration, wants to see some positive movement in Gaza, something that they can sell and say, okay, Israel is now cooperating. We're towards rebuilding parts of Gaza. If we can get the people in Gaza to go along with this, new housing areas being built in the area controlled by Israel, and that will allow people to move back and keep in Gaza to move in and keep Hamas out. That's the American plan. So you have Kushner coming, the president's son-in-law. You have Tony Blair, the head of the Board of Peace. You have Nikolai Mladinov, the special representative, the former UN special representative, who in practice is the one who's running the whole process. And they're trying to convince Netanyahu and the Israeli government to allow more flexibility in Gaza. And that's going to be a real test to see how much Israel will agree to that and what are the military or security costs and dangers. We're hearing soldiers that are based along the border saying that we hear activity by Hamas again, and it's becoming threatening. So that's something that has to be really thrashed out with the Americans. What do we do first? And it can't be allowed to stay as limbo indefinitely. There's nature abhors a vacuum, and so does sort of politics. You got to put a plan on the table. The plan now is the Board of Peace, and Israel has to find a way to show flexibility while maintaining its vital security interests. I'll say a word or two about the Straits of Hormuz, and we can maybe go back to that later. But I think there is an economic war going on. There is a military force behind that economic war. And the Americans are trying to prevent Iran from exporting oil, preventing tankers with that oil from leaving the area. And we see military action when necessary. The Iranians are doing the same thing in terms of exports that will go to the West that will then serve American or Western interests. And that's going to escalate, I think. If there was see more action on that, it may be quiet for a few days. Then we're going to see tankers that might be being hit. There's going to be various attempts to try to gain some advantage. And that's where the war really is, or the conflict is now taking place. And it's a serious one. It has major consequences. November 3rd elections, as Relik said in the United States, if gas prices go up, that's going to definitely hurt the Republicans. And at the same time, Iran's going to worry about unemployment, about lack of any kind of revenue. And the result could be, if they don't have it, they could have civil unrest, and that could threaten the regime. That's the strategy we're seeing now. And that's why I'm saying the rhetoric is not that important. It doesn't really tell us anything new. What's important is what's being done, not on the ground, but in the waters around the Straits of Hormuz. And also, by the way, where the Houthi forces are operating at the bottom of the Red Sea. And we'll see whether that escalates and whether that's going to cause also a decrease in the flow of oil to the West or higher costs.
And Relik, what about the nuclear issue? You know, we've been talking about the economic war. And as we heard J.D. Vance, the vice president, say, that's become the number one primary goal for America. The White House, of course, later clarifying that both goals, including the nuclear issue, are equal. Now, Israel has said that if the U.S. leaves this issue unresolved, the nuclear issue, it will return to finish the job on its own. So what do you make of this, of the nuclear issue?
I don't think the United States is going to leave this untackled. President Trump's standings really depends on making sure that this takes place. I mean, disarming Iran. But the United States did not really understand how the Iranians are preparing to use the Hormuz Straits, the mining and attacking the Gulf states as a weapon, and was surprised when it took place. And so this had become a major point to resolve. But let's not forget that the reason that the United States went into this war with Israel, of course, is the nuclear program. Now, the nuclear program at this time, the material is buried deep, and at least us in the public, we don't know if anybody has access to the piles of uranium below the ground. But one thing is for sure, whether the United States is active or not, Israel will continue. Probably most of the actions will be covert, but it'll become harder and harder if the Iranians continue their plan and actually build it in the mountains where they're having some of their ballistic missiles in the long run. So maybe the Iranians will cave in just the way they had in 1988 when Khomeini actually gave up the war against Iraq because they depleted all their resources. This may repeat itself, but it doesn't mean that in the long run, they will not try to rearm themselves. And this really depends on the United States' stamina on the long run to take care of this. And as far as long-term stamina, the Iranians have proven that they are better at this than almost anybody else. And the United States, that's a weaker point there. So at least the Iranians can, if they can hold on for 2 more years, one way or another, they might be in the safe zone within 2 years. Let's hope not.
Indeed, Gerald, turning to you on Relik's point, we actually did hear Iranian officials just over the weekend saying exactly this, saying they're looking for, extending this war, sort of, running a war of attrition and dragging it out for 2 years until President Trump leaves office. And then, as Relik said, they feel that they would also be safe. I mean, what's your take on this?
In one sense, there's a logic to what they're saying, and that's the predictable strategy. As Relik said, they've been doing this strategy for a long time. It wasn't just in 1988 when they agreed to a very, what they call the humiliating ceasefire in the war with Iraq, it was standstill, but they also lowered the level of the nuclear activity significantly back around 2002, 2003, in order to avoid a large-scale American attack at that time. And then they ramped it up again when the coast was clear, when they thought they had the capability to do that. I think we're going to see that repeated again now. They're going to maintain relatively low visibility work on the nuclear program. And when they see an opportunity, then they'll, what's called breakout, they'll try to go further for that. I think Israel has the key role to play here. That Israel does have the capability, if necessary, to attack those areas where there are nuclear activities taking place, overtly or covertly, as Relik said. There's a long history of that. And Israel, certainly, the actions Israel has taken has significantly delayed and impaired the nuclear program that Iran undertook. 20 years ago, the Iranians would not have expected that they had not crossed the finish line here in 2026, but that's the reality. So that there will be Israeli capabilities. I'm sure that there are teams of Israelis working very much on that, probably in coordination with their American counterparts. I don't think that's going to change regardless of the election results, either in Washington or in Israel. That it's going to be a primary goal of both countries to make sure that Iran does not cross the nuclear threshold, particularly after the war that we saw over the last year or so. We've seen the ballistic missile capabilities and the other things that Iran has. Therefore, nuclear weapons would be an extremely dangerous addition.
Absolutely. So these are going to be critical weeks ahead, at least until the November elections, and then we'll see what happens, and we'll see if this strategy of economic pressure by the Trump administration will actually bear some fruit. Brigadier General Relik Shafir and Professor Gerald Steinberg, thank you both so much for joining us today and for your analysis.